Good evening. Is this on? Can you hear me now? Doing something different. I don't know how to work. I may get all kinds of prank calls and all that stuff, but for those at home, if you have a question, that's my number that should be on your screen now at home, 504-6912. I've got my phone here, and I'll try to look at it. Or even if you're in the auditorium and have a question, you don't want to yell it out, then or a comment, you can text that. I'll try to keep my eye on it, and we'll get to it at some point. It is good to be together, and I thank you for being here. A personal request. My son Brian, my middle son Brian, is now a traveling nurse. He will be in Harlem, New York on Monday. Why? I don't know. But I can tell you this. Mama ain't happy, as you could imagine. But if y'all would pray for Brian, then we would appreciate that. I hadn't really confirmed with him 8-10 weeks, something like that. I guess that he will be there, and so a lot to think about and a lot to worry about. If you tend to be a worrier, I try not to be, but I would certainly appreciate you remembering Brian in your prayers. Last week we started at 2 Corinthians chapter 6, verses 11 through 13, and we'll continue there this evening. 2 Corinthians chapter 6, verses 11 through 13. As Paul was addressing the Corinthians, and what we were talking about is his statement regarding hearts wide open. There in chapter 6, verse 11 says, "O Corinthians, we have spoken openly to you. Our heart is wide open. You are not restricted by us, but you are restricted by your own affections. Now in return for the same, I speak as to children, you also be open." And we spend our time looking at what was meant there as what he was referring to with hearts wide open, and why we need open hearts. And that's really what we were getting into last week. We talked along that line of why we need hearts wide open. Then it is, we talked about brotherly love is a mark of true discipleship. And so if you're going to have love, and for those that weren't here, we're just kind of a real quick review, I guess, is we mentioned 2 Corinthians chapter 12 and verse 15, where Paul said, "I will gladly spend and be spent for your souls, though the more abundantly I love you, the less I am loved." That's a very telling verse. Paul, in talking to other Christians, says, the more I love you, the less I am loved. And so indicates that sometimes Paul's affection was one-sided, and that brought up, I think, the passage there in chapter 6, verses 11 through 13 that we've just read. And that indicates, verse 11, that Paul's heart was wide open toward the Corinthians, but their love for him was restricted. And I think Sheriff's asked the question about what it might mean there in restricted, but I think it's kind of like I think of airflow or blood flow. If it is not flowing freely and it is not flowing properly, then it is restricted for varying reasons. And I think that's what Paul was trying to point out to them, is that their love was restricted, and it really went back to their heart. And so he exhorted them in verse 13 to be open in their relationships. And then we talked about why we need hearts wide open. I've already mentioned that about brotherly love as a mark of true discipleship. We also mentioned brotherly love as a mark of spiritual growth and maturity. And then we mentioned that brotherly love is an assurance of our faith. That kind of is a real quick review of what we spent our time talking about last week in regard to this passage. We're going to continue in looking at that passage and consider, first of all, the question, why do some have restricted hearts? Why did Paul say your hearts are restricted? You have any thoughts? Why do you think some, and when I say that, it's certainly an opinion. We'll talk about some things that I've written down. 2 Corinthians chapter 6, verses 11 through 13. What do you think caused them, or maybe would cause us, to have restricted hearts?
I think the restricted part would be if a person's love or whatever is restricted, it's not doing the job that it could be doing. It's lacking in its responsibility.
Okay, Johnny says if our love is restricted, if our hearts are restricted, then that keeps our heart from acting as it should. And we can make a correlation even of our physical health. You know, if our heart is not operating as it should, then there's some kind of issue going on. And a lot of times it's a restriction issue. And they've got to go in and put a stent in. And sometimes we could make the correlation that we may need some spiritual stents. John.
And the English Standard Version said that it is restricted in your own affections. So their love is not the love of God. The love is outside. So because of that, other things that are going on, that's why their love is being restricted.
Okay. John makes the point, I believe it was from the American Standard Version. Is that what you say? English Standard Version, that their affection is used there and the being restricted, and outside influences play a part into that.
If our love is restricted and we have, I would say, a talent to show love or whatever, to be affectionate to members of the church, it's an encouragement. And when we withhold that, there may be people that we can look at and shake a hand and it just thrills them to death and encourages them. Whereas, if we hold the talent that we might have, however small it might be, it's still what we should use.
Okay, Johnny makes the point that, if we have the ability, which is not an if in this sense, we do. We have the ability to love, and we have the ability to love with hearts wide open. But if our heart is restricted, we're not loving, then we're not encouraging people like we should. We may even be discouraging people. We're going to talk about some of these things. Why? Why is it? And that's really where we're at now. And I have a few in my notes, and if you have any you want to throw out, then get my attention. First of all, why would some have restricted hearts? Perhaps it may be due to ignorance. And I believe we made this point last week and right at the end when we were getting ready to close. But this idea of ignorance. And I made the point that the Corinthians were not bad people. They made some poor decisions sometimes, as all Christians do, but we know that Paul wrote this to a church that had a lot of problems, and they had a lot of problems because of self, and they were self-centered and didn't have the unity that they needed, and that goes back to self. But they had a lot of issues, and one of those was this idea of love and properly loving. And again, what keeps us from doing that? Self, a lot of times, and it's our view toward self and our attitude toward self and where we place self in regard to others, and that keeps us from, it sometimes makes our hearts restricted. Our attitude towards self does. But the idea of ignorance, some of the Christians may not have been given the proper follow-up. They may have been unbalanced in what follow-up they had. And I believe the point I'm about to make goes, I think, to what John Graber was saying. And sometimes perhaps they had an emphasis on the external as opposed to the internal. And when we're focusing on the external, then we're going to be restricted in the kind of love that we have and the way that we exhibit that love. Really, that's, if you boil it down, that's one of the fundamental, maybe the fundamental difference in the old law and the new law. The old law focused on what? The external. What does the new law focus on? The internal, the heart, the spiritual, as opposed to the physical. And, if any, we need to cut the Corinthians some slack, and I do that most of the time. If anybody had a reason to be confused over this, it was those Christians in the first century, wasn't it, that had seen the law of Moses, and some had even been under the law of Moses and influenced by the law of Moses. And so now with Christianity focusing on the internal, they needed some special attention and some special prodding and some special encouragement, and that's what Paul is doing. And certainly we're some 200 or 2,000 years out, and we can't use that as an excuse anymore. 1 John chapter 4, verse 20. If someone says, I love God, and hates his brother, he is a liar. For he who does not love his brother whom he has seen, how can he love God whom he has not seen? And this commandment we have from him, that he who loves God must love his brother also. And so if the Corinthians had that issue, and we could argue and cut them some slack based upon where they were in history, we can't cut ourselves that same slack. If we're not loving the right way, it's not probably because of the same fundamental problem that the Corinthians had, but yet it could be the same broad issue of having hearts that are restricted. Another, yes. Okay. Bob mentions verses 14, I think it's through 17, is that what you said, Bob? 14 through 17 needs to be addressed, and I think I have it in my notes that we will address that, but Bob brings up a good point, is that a lot of their issue was with the external that we've already talked about. The things of the world, the people of the world, the sins of the world, the worldliness. And so that was something that was restricting them from being what they should be. And certainly that still exists today, doesn't it? And so we certainly need to be aware of and familiar with that. I'm going to hold that. I was going to go ahead and read that, Bob, but I'm going to hold that a little bit. We'll get to, hopefully get to that in a few minutes. The second thing that I have in my notes as to why someone may have a restricted heart is it might be the result of spiritual amnesia. We can look at Peter, 2 Peter chapter 1 and verse 9. And Peter said, "He that lacks these things is short-sighted, even to blindness." He's talking again to Christians. And they were talked about being short-sighted or blind and have forgotten that he was cleansed from his old sins. Sometimes we get spiritual amnesia and we forget where we came from, and we forget what was done for us, and we forget what it means to be a Christian. And when we forget that, when we have that spiritual amnesia, Peter says is short-sightedness or even blindness, then that certainly serves to restrict our hearts. And that's going to occur when we forget God's love for us and how He purged our sins. Again, there in 2 Peter chapter 1 and verse 9. The verses 5 through 10 here is talking about the Christian graces. But when we don't apply all diligence, and that's something that Peter encourages, as he encourages to add to your faith virtue, and your virtue knowledge, your knowledge temperance, and on and on and on. But you got to give diligence to that. And when we stop being diligent, then we're giving rise to spiritual amnesia and to becoming blind of where we once were and where we need to be. And it just happens sometime that with the passing of time, we may simply forget how important that love is in the mind of God. Remember 1 Corinthians chapter 13 and verse 13. The greatest of these, it talks about faith, hope, and charity, and the greatest of these is charity or love. And certainly we need to always be reminded of how important love is in the mind of God and in the life of a Christian. Now, some folks are restricted, their hearts are restricted because they perhaps have skeletons in the closet. We have skeletons in the closet. What do we want to do? Or what do we not want to do? We don't want to get close to somebody, generally. We've got things to hide, or we're ashamed, or we're not proud, and all of those things. And we see that, don't we? People stop coming around us. We can think about our assemblies. People stop coming around. Why? A lot of times it's because there's skeletons in the closet. And they don't want to get close or to be close or for people. Because when you're close to somebody, then they're going to know you and they're going to find out things about you, which is part of it, isn't it? When we have a relationship and when we are close. But as we think about what causes some people's hearts to be restricted, sometimes it's because of their life and their decisions and the things that they're doing. And I just chose to call it skeletons in the closet. Some people just refuse to let people get close to them for fear that some hidden secret may become known. What do? Get rid of them. That's all. So it sounds pretty simple, doesn't it? We got skeletons in the closet. We need to get rid of them. We've got things in our lives that we're not proud of. We need to change it. We need to get rid of it. We need to do what we can do to correct that. They're eventually going to become known. Numbers chapter 32 and verse 23. Be sure your sin will what? Find you out at some time, at some point. It may be now, it may be later, but most likely it will come out. 1 Timothy chapter 5 and verse 24. And when we remove those skeletons, we remove those barriers, then we don't mind people knowing us. And we really don't mind how well they know us. And we need to remember that no one is perfect. And we all need the help of our brethren. And sometimes people become restricted because they've cut themselves off from the brethren. And that's going to adversely affect us. Another reason that our hearts may be restricted is that we may have a fear of getting hurt. And that gets into the kind of carry over from the last point. Another reason sometimes we don't want to have a relationship or to get close to people or to have the right kind of love is for a fear of getting hurt. Because when we have relationships, then there is the risk of having those relationships scarred or marred. And so for some, there is a fear there. We've already read and we know the fact that Paul experienced rejection. We read about it in Corinth, but also I think it happened in Rome. 2 Timothy chapter 4 and verse 16. But the joy of true fellowship and the joy of true Christian love can and should more than make up for the few times that rejection may happen, or that our relationships are adversely affected. We can read about John, 3 John, verses 1 through 4, and also verses 9 through 11, and we see in just those few verses that John experienced both love and rejection, even among the brethren. But if he had never taken the risk of running into a Diotrephes, he would have never known the joy of finding someone like Gaius. And so the risk and the reward of having the proper kind of love toward Christians and striving to have the proper relationship with Christians, the reward should far outweigh the risk. Any comments? Another reason that there could be restriction and have restricted hearts is maybe true conversion has not taken place. There's not been a true conversion. What does it mean to be converted? Not a trick question. We think about conversion. We go to Acts and we have the examples of conversion. What are we talking about? Can't hear, sorry. Okay, conversion is turning away from one thing and turning toward something else. You want to add to that? Anybody got any other thoughts? As we think about when we're in church and we think about conversion, or we think about the examples of conversion in the book of Acts, all of those people were being converted to what? Christianity. And we could, you go through and you think about Saul, and you think about the jailer, and you think about Cornelius, and you think about the eunuch, and all those examples that we could think of them about. All of them were different things, perhaps, but they needed to become Christians. And so that's what, when we talk about conversion, when we talk about being converted, we're talking about becoming a Christian. And this idea that I said that some people are restricted because they've not truly been converted. What does that mean? If somebody has not truly been converted, what might that mean? I'm sorry? Okay, still hanging on to their old ways. What else? All right, not committed, not willing to change. Might they want to change? Might they want to be a Christian? But what are they not willing to do? Pay the price, make the change, do what they need to do. Be obedient, okay? And that's what it really boils down to. Some people just aren't willing to be truly and wholly obedient. And therefore, they may not be truly converted. And certainly I would encourage all of us to examine ourselves. We should do that regularly, periodically. I don't know what word we want to use. I'm saying we have to do it every day, but it probably wouldn't hurt, would it? To examine ourselves. 2 Corinthians chapter 13 and verse 5. Examine yourselves as to whether you are in the faith. Test yourselves. Jack. Okay. Genesis chapter 4, verses 6 and 7. Jack Horton made the reference to Genesis chapter 4, verses 6 and 7 when the Lord spoke to Cain. And the reference there is for him to do well. And Jack made the point that in order for him to do well, he needed to give up some things. And most likely that was anger that existed. And we can apply that, and looking at our lives, we need to be doing well, and sometimes to do well, and we talked about it Sunday to some degree. There's some things that we need to get rid of. We need to throw them away or sell them, but then there's some things that are worth keeping, and so we need to examine ourselves whether we're in the faith. Hopefully we can get through this last point with some suggestions on what we can do to have hearts wide open. That's what Paul is encouraging there in our passage, is for them, and therefore we're trying to learn from that. So for us to have hearts wide open, what can we do? Well, first of all, we can let God's love teach us. And that appears to be what was the case with the Thessalonians, that they were able to excel in their love. 1 Thessalonians chapter 4 and verse 9. And so we need to take the time, and some of us maybe need to take more time to contemplate on God's love for us and how that was manifested through the blessing and the blessings that He has bestowed upon us. And we can't name all of them. I would mention one of the blessings is just the fact that we're His child. And He is our Father, 1 John chapter 3 and verse 1. We have the blessing of Jesus being our propitiation. 1 John chapter 4 verses 9 and 10. I ask our class Sunday morning, I'll ask you, we hear that word in church, propitiation. What does that mean? What? Appeasing sacrifice. And if I were you and you've not already done it, I would encourage you to turn there to that passage and that talks about propitiation, 1 John chapter 4, verses 9 and 10, and write down that that is an appeasement. Propitiation is an appeasing sacrifice, and really, Jesus died on the cross. He is our propitiation in that, what does He appease? The wrath of God. Jesus died to appease the wrath of God. And we need to think about what has been done for us. A few weeks ago on Wednesday night, it's back before we were meeting back. I was still in my office, but I remember talking about, the fact that God, we're the ones, if our relationship with God is severed, it's because I've severed it. I've left. I've moved. God didn't go anywhere. Yet God is the one that has done everything for reconciliation to be possible. Now, I've got to make a decision. I've got to want to be reconciled, but God has done everything. It doesn't matter how vile I once may have been. God has done everything for me to be reconciled to Him. He's even sent the appeasing sacrifice to appease His wrath toward me. We need to think about that kind of love. Another thing that may help us in having a heart wide open is to never be content with the present state of our love. Always be working to improve. Paul didn't let the Thessalonians rest on their laurels. There in 1 Thessalonians chapter 4 and verse 10, he said, "But concerning brotherly love, you have no need that I should write to you, for you yourselves are taught by God to love one another. And indeed, you do so toward all the brethren who are in all Macedonia. But we urge you, brethren, that you increase more and more." He commended them, didn't he? Talking about their great love, but he says it needs to increase. It needs to be better. And so the key idea here is to increase more and more. Peter would say to abound, 2 Peter chapter 1 and verse 8. And then the third thing that I would mention about suggesting what we can do to have hearts wide open is to realize love takes time. So take time to love. You know, sometimes we're just too busy, aren't we? We get too busy, and what we used to say, take time to smell the roses. I don't know how old that phrase, been around a long time, hadn't it? I bet Wanda, that's been around long enough. Even when Wanda was, that's a pretty long time, Wanda. Just kidding. But take time to smell the roses. We need to take time to love, to make time. And don't be just too busy to do what we need to do as a Christian. Take advantage of opportunities to be with the brethren and to encourage the brethren and to let them encourage you. For most of us, that's the hardest thing about the last few months is not having the fellowship, not enjoying the times with our feet under the same table. Whether it's sitting and visiting, whether it's sitting and eating, whether it's sitting and playing games. But we miss those times of our feet under the same table. And we long for those, and I hope that we'll take advantage of those when we have the opportunity. So hopefully this has encouraged us to consider our heart. What kind of heart do we have? Is it a heart wide open, or is our heart somewhat restricted when it comes to our love is what we've concentrated on, but they're just our overall Christian attitude. And, not only are hearts restricted in the love that we show, but our hearts sometimes are such that we restrict the love that we receive, and I'm referring to the love of God and the love of Christ. And sometimes our hearts become so restricted that we're even restricted from the flow of God's love because of our decisions and the things that we've done. Any comments?
I think we have to remember we're probably tonight we're the core, some of the core group. Our job as Christians, and I think most of us have wide open hearts, really want to be going out and encouraging in such a way to find others to see what kind of hearts they have and how we can help them to put stents in their heart, to open their hearts. And I think that's part of us. Even if, as we talked before, all we have to do is get on the telephone and call. All we have to do is send a note. And I think that our heart will become more open as we bring somebody else along. When you see someone else start to grow, that makes us, our heart, really bigger.
Yep, that's a good point. We do sometimes we have a tendency to look at other people and to think about other people, and we say, boy, I hope so-and-so's listening to this lesson. Or, boy, I wish so-and-so was here to hear this lesson. And we get so caught up in so-and-so that we don't let it apply to us. And we need to realize what we can do and what we can accomplish. Thank you so much for being here, and Lord willing, we'll be back next week and we'll talk about true repentance out of 2 Corinthians chapter 7.
just really quick, if I may. Peggy Davis received a good report on Monday about her shoulder that's healing. She's going through therapy now, but continue to remember Peggy in your prayers. Also, Peggy's brother Harvey, he's now at home following surgery that he had on Sunday. It was an emergency surgery that he needed, and he is home. So continue to remember him as he recovers. And also, remember Robert Lassiter. He's going to be going in for a procedure to have a stent put in, and they're going to try that, I believe, next week. I have the date. I have forgotten the date, but remember him in your prayers. We received word that Nancy Clifton is going to have a procedure on Friday to relieve some pain in her back. So she has asked for our prayers as well. So remember all those. Take note of the bulletin and all the announcements that are in there as well. Steve Livingston's going to come and lead us in our singing. I'll say a few words in a devotional. Then our close of service, Barney Vineyard, will dismiss us in prayer. Steve?
Everyone sing out. Faithful love flowing down from the foam-covered ground makes me whole, saves my soul, washes whiter than snow. Faithful love comes each year, reaches down, dries each tear, holds my hand when I can't stand on my own. Faithful love came to earth to show the Father's love, and no man be the same, for I see faithful love face to face, and Jesus is His name. Faithful love is our friend, as we know, sings to men, welcome face, sweet embrace, tender touch, filled with grace. Faithful love, endless power, living faith, spiritual fire, burning bright in the night, lighting my way. Faithful If I was to ask you what you remember about David,
Think about what you would say. Many people, when they think about David, we think of two stories concerning David. We think of David and Goliath. The story of what we call a young boy. And we get this imagery of this really small child, may be biblical, may not be biblical in some ways, but this little small child who goes to see his brothers, sees a giant, a 9-foot, 9-inch giant making fun of God's people and insulting them every day, and really gets into everybody else's business. And says, why isn't somebody going out to fight him? What's the problem? And we know how the story ends. David goes and he grabs some stones, he puts them in a sling, and he kills Goliath. Then we think of David with Bathsheba. Those are typically the two stories that we think about regarding David's life. I want to ask that you think about Psalm 51 for a moment. I want to point out some really quick things of Psalm 51, but Psalm 51 is written after David's sin with Bathsheba. Now, when David writes this, David is in a very unique place in his life. It's a place that the king of Israel has never been ever before, because no prophet has come to the king of Israel, has come to David to his face, told him a parable, looked right at David, into his eyes, into his heart, and said, "It's you." And when Nathan said that, I don't think that Nathan just said, "It's you." I think Nathan probably raised his voice and probably was pretty blunt. And he calls out David for what David had done. Because David had taken everything and swept it under the rug. We understand this. But did you ever think of how David felt? Not just that David had sinned, but that David was broken. David was damaged. David was cracked. David was in pieces. Because sometimes what we overlook is the emotions of what David went through. The emotions of being broken. In our high school class, we've been talking about the cycle of COVID regarding our Christianity, regarding our worship services. During lockdown, depressions rise and suicides rise, and actually they're saying now that they've multiplied. The numbers weren't right in the very beginning, and the idea of loneliness skyrocketed. What do you think went through David's mind when he was told by Nathan that the sword is never going to leave your house? And not only that, the son that Bathsheba has, this child that Bathsheba has, rather, that child's not going to make it. What do you think went through David's mind? How do you think he felt? David was broken. He was angry. He was frustrated. He was emotional. He was sad. He was willing to do anything that it took just to get back to normal. So David sits down, as we believe David does, and he pens Psalm 51. And I want you to listen to the beginning of Psalm 51. And I want you to take whatever emotions that you have felt recently, whether you're broken, battered, bruised, depressed, angry, frustrated, sad, mad, and I want you to hear the words of David. David says, "Have mercy on me, O God, according to your steadfast love. According to your abundant mercy, blot out my transgressions. Wash me thoroughly from my iniquity and cleanse me from my sin." He says, "For you know my transgressions, and my sin is ever before me. Against you and you only have I sinned, and have done evil that is in your sight, so that you may have justified in your words and be blameless in your judgment. I was brought forth in iniquity, and in sin my mother conceived me, but you delight in the inward being. You teach me wisdom in the secret heart." David, no matter how sinful David was, no matter the giant killer that David did, or that David had done, David was brought to his knees. He was brought to his knees in a moment of trial. But here's what I want you to remember. Tonight at least, and tomorrow, I don't want you to remember the David that killed Goliath. I don't want you to remember the courageousness of David. I don't want you to think of David and Bathsheba, how, David could have turned away, and he could have, there's about 15 different things that David could have stopped that at any moment, and David did not. I don't want you to think about that. I want you to think about what David did. When David was broken and hurt and angry, David cried out to God. If you're broken and you're hurt and you're angry, have you cried out to God? Not on a Sunday morning, not on a Wednesday night, but on a Monday or a Tuesday or a Wednesday. Because here's what David does. I just want to tell you really quick. As David cries out to God, I want you to remember verse 7, verse 8, verse 9, verse 10, verse 11, and verse 12. Because David asked God to do something. And if you look at these words, and we're not going to break them down tonight, But look at these words. Just listen to what he says. He says, "Purge me with hyssop, and I shall be clean. Wash me, and I will be whiter than snow." Purge me and wash me. Typically when we pray, what do we say? God, forgive me for my sins and help me to live better. But not David. David says, everything that's in here, I want it gone. I want it gone. Wash me. Once that's gone, I want you to cleanse me. Wash me all over so that I am whiter than snow. He says, let your joy and gladness, let the bones that you have broken rejoice. Hide your face from my sins. He says, God, when you do away with that, I don't want you to look at that. I don't want you to look at those. It says, and blot out my iniquities. Then he says, create in me a clean heart and renew a right spirit within me. But here's how broken David is. Even though he's asking God for healing, he says this in verse 11, cast me not away from your presence. Don't take your Holy Spirit from me. He says, I'm hurt. Don't leave me. Even though you're going to wash me, he says, don't leave me. Then he says, restore me to the joy of your salvation and uphold me with a willing spirit. Do you know what it took for the king of Israel to write that? Brokenness. Anger. A realization that the change that David needed to make starts with him. Doesn't start with anybody else, but it started with him. Started with his relationship with God, and here's what happens next. Verse 13. I'll let you read the rest of the chapter tonight if you want to, but verse 13, he says, then I will teach transgressors your ways, and sinners will return to you. He doesn't say, I might teach transgressors your ways, and sinners might return to you. He says, I will teach them, and they will return. Do you know why? Because David went to God as a new man. As a new man. He didn't just say, God, change me. He said, God, take everything in here and get it out. And when you get it out, don't ignore me, but put everything back in me right. So here's my question. We're all probably tired of these things. And we've all probably over the past several months been frustrated, depressed, maybe broken, maybe angry, and it may not be because of COVID. It may be because of our own choices. It may be because we allowed somebody else's choices to affect our spirituality. I would ask you the question, where did you go? Did you go to God as David did? As much grief as we give David for the sin with Bathsheba, we've all committed sins that have hung Jesus on the cross. But do we go to God and ask Him to purge us, to cleanse us, to create in us, to not turn away from us, but to restore us? And not just to restore us to the same condition, but restore us to a greater condition so that we can tell everybody outside of this building and through these doors how our lives have been changed by God. So one more time. If you're broken, where have you turned? God is the full healer of mankind. He's the one who sent His Son Jesus to save our souls. How broken do you have to be before you make things right? Are you ready tonight? Are you ready to make your life right? You ready to have a clean heart and to start fresh? If it's a private matter between you and God, make that known to God. Cry out to Him. Let Him hear your prayer. Let Him hear your words. Let Him hear about what He needs to hear about, because He already knows. But if it's something we can do for you, why don't you let us know? Because we've all cried out. And we've all asked God to heal us and to take care of us. And He has. And He will again. So if there's anything that we can do to help you out, Steve has picked a song of invitation. We're going to sing this song. If it's between you and God, make that right. If it's something that we can do for you this evening, won't you make it known by coming to the front? While together we stand and as we sing.
Crush your mind, so forget our services Sunday morning, 9:30 worship service, Bible class at 10:30, and 5 o'clock. Is there any more announcements that we haven't said?
Okay, we're going to have one more song, and then Barney will lead us in our closing prayer.
Just the first verse. Take the